Hi there, this is Vespasian, and today I'm going to be showing you my brand new shiny T35 main battle tanks for my Russian army. This is a bit off the wall, this particular project. The T35 was a super heavy tank of the period, and it was of course Russian. The primary purpose for this tank was to support T28s, which were large tanks with a howitzer mounted on the roof and two machine gun turrets at the front, and these guys were designed to smash through enemy defences. This was designed as a support tank for the T28s to give the T28s an anti-tank ability. And as you can see from these models, there is an anti-tank turret at the front, an anti-tank turret at the rear. They're both 45mm anti-tank guns, so in bolt action, bear in mind this is for bolt action, they'll be classed as light anti-tank guns. However, there's maximum tank you're going to get in this period is a medium tank, so the light anti-tank gun with its 4 plus 4 anti-tank ability is pretty good. It is a pretty good gun. Most tanks of this period were light tanks, which only gives them an armour of 7. So these guys are pretty good at anti-tank. So that's the anti-tank guns. You can position the tank so it can fire 2 anti-tank guns at the same time, which means you can double the normal firepower of a tank. Also, you have a big main turret on the very top, that's this one, that carries a 76mm howitzer, which is also not too bad at shooting at light tanks, but it's a really powerful howitzer and will do serious damage to troops in defensive positions. And given it's a howitzer, it can fire high, and you can have indirect fire against trenches and things like that. And also people in buildings are going to be in trouble with a howitzer firing at them. In buildings you half the amount of damage, so this howitzer can roll 1d6 damage and therefore inflict at least 3 casualties on your enemy, plus that extra pin marker. Nextly, there are the machine guns. There's a machine gun turret at the front and a machine gun turret at the rear. Both the main turrets carry machine guns too, so instead of firing the anti-tank, you can fire a machine gun, meaning you can fire 3 machine guns in any direction. There's also a machine gun on the main turret of the main turret as well. And on the front hull there's another machine gun. So this tank is machine gun heavy and can fire at least 12 dice of machine gun in any direction, at least 12. Mostly you're probably going to be firing 16 dice in any direction, and that's if you don't fire your howitzers. But that's a lot of dice going in enemy troops, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. We've only used one so far, and it didn't actually get a chance to do anything before it got blown up by a Japanese suicide bomber.
No idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, that was really embarrassing. But you'll have to check my battle reports to find that game. So we haven't actually used them in battle yet. They do work in conjunction usually. They have one of these tanks with 2 T28 tanks, and I've got 4 T28s to go with these. So you would have one of these massive tanks supported by the 2 other massive tanks, and that will be interesting. These are medium tanks, they're not heavy tanks. By the rules they're classed as medium tanks, although at the time they were considered heavy. Maximum 80mm of armour, that's just on the facing of the turret. Normally the front armour was about 60mm and about between 20 and 40 for various parts of the side. So it's classed as a medium tank, which again is going to cause trouble for the Allies, for the Axis, well, whichever way you look at it, for the Japanese and the Russians, the Japanese and the Finns and the Chinese and the Germans obviously. They're going to have trouble because all of their tanks are equipped with light anti-tank guns. There are no heavy medium anti-tank guns at the outbreak of war when these guys were around, so it's very hard taking these guys out because they're going to have 8 armour when you're firing at them.
Yeah, but the only reason I destroyed it is because I rolled a really big dice, so...
Yeah, he used a hollow shape charge on the end of a stick to take out the tank, and it was a perfect hit, and he rolled a number of sixes, so the tank exploded. Yeah, so they're pretty heavy. Oh, they're very heavy. They are the heaviest tank you can get in the period. There was another type of Russian tank which was also heavy, but that looked more like a train, and I don't know if they were ever even used in combat. I've never been able to find anything about it.
Wasn't that the naval gun?
No. It had a Katyushka on the back, meaning it had to be later than late 1940, early 41. So, because the Katyushka didn't come out until 41. The first test beds were in 40, before the Germans invaded. So it's post the Finnish War. Yeah, so these tanks were used all over the place in the 1930s. They were formed into two separate tank divisions by 1941, by the end of 1940, beginning of 1941. And there was a discussion as to whether or not to take them out of service completely, but the German invasion meant that they were pressed into service, and they were practically all wiped out. Not by the Germans, but because they kept breaking down. You've got a really big heavy tank with lots of track, lots of wheels, there's lots of bits that can go wrong with them when you're driving around in them, and they tended to break down quite easily, and so most of them were actually burnt by their own crews. So they had a ignoble end, really, for such a beautiful looking tank. In combat, they actually served very well. Your biggest problem was they were fighting in combat against the Finns, and they couldn't generally see the Finns. That was a problem. The Finns tended to hide, and so they tried using them as infantry support vehicles, which didn't really work out, and then they tried using them for what they were designed for, which was attacking the Mannerheim line, and that worked. They actually did what they were designed to do, which is break through heavily fortified defences. But once they were through there, they were used in small groups and unsupported by infantry, and they generally didn't actually serve that well, just like the rest of the heavy Russian tanks. So it's really up to you how you use them if you're going to get some of these yourself. These particular ones are scratch built. I built them I made a box of card, and I made the turrets, and well, it's scratch built. I made it out of all sorts of junk I found lying around. But there is a kit out there you can buy. It is quite expensive because there are not many other kits around, but I'm sure you could be able to find one if you want to find one, or you can knock one out yourself like this. So you are going to see these used in my battle reports in the near future. We're not doing any bolt action for a short while because we're still trying to get all this Hail Caesar stuff sorted out, but I am working on the new tanks and stuff ready for when we start doing bolt action again. So you can look forward to lots of new bolt action reports, and you're going to see my new stuff I've been cobbling together. Any comments?
Why did they use me small groups once they went for the heavy defence?
Bad command and control. The Russian army was extremely badly organised and badly commanded, partly because Stalin shot most of the officers who knew what they were doing. So they had junior officers suddenly promoted to high-ranking officers, like colonels. A colonel would suddenly become a general and stuff.
Who didn't know how to command.
Who really didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. They hadn't had time to acclimatise, and they were thrown in against the Finns, and they suddenly found themselves fighting at the front line with vehicles they weren't used to operating with. The guy in charge of this division in Finland, the T35 division, which had a few of these with them, the guy who was supposed to be in charge was shot by Stalin. He was taken over by by a guy who had been his secretary type thing, one of his officers. But he didn't have the first idea about tanks. He was an artilleryman, so he didn't know what he was doing. These are heavily armoured tanks designed for invasions, and they're designed to drive at the enemy while anti-tank guns are firing at them, and the bullets are bouncing off, and they overrun trenches, hence the length of the tank. The length of the tank is so you can drive over a trench without any trouble. And they used to put fascines on the back and roll them off as they went over so lighter tanks could cross over. So they're brilliant for that. But once you get over that sort of defensive battle, breaking through that defensive battle, you then have your tanks in open fields Your infantry are left behind because there's machine guns going off and stuff. Your infantry have to consolidate, and your tanks tend to get lost, or they're out on their own, and the Finns can run up to them, so petrol bombs on them. They were also fighting in snow, which didn't do the Russian engines much good, because the Russians, believe it or not, the Russian engines didn't fare any better in snow than German engines did. So there was a problem with operating in the situation they were operating in. Bad command and control, really bad terrain they were operating in. A number of the T-28s were lost by actually falling through the ice, because they tried to attack across lakes, and the Finns fired artillery on the lakes broke up and the tanks sank into the water, whereas the lighter, the BTs and the T-26s, were usually able to scrabble out of the ice before they went under, but these were so heavy, and 33 tons one of these things, they just sink straight down and you never see them again. Bad for the crews too. Any more questions?
No, that's all questions I've got.
Yeah. Another thing about, I should mention about it, is the tanks themselves would not have been of any use to the Russians later on in the war. After the Germans attacked the Russians were no longer fighting an offensive battle. The Russian army was designed almost entirely towards offence, not defence. And its combat doctrine, involving thousands of paratroops and heavy tanks to smash through defences and all that sort of stuff, that is not a defensive way of fighting. And so this sort of tank would have been obsolete anyway for the Russians, regardless. And so these lovely, massive, supermassive tanks were no use to the Russians right up until the 43, 44, when the Russians began to push into Germany. That's when you needed something like this. And of course, the tank that came after this was the KV series, followed by the Joseph Stalin series, and they were basically harder versions of this tank. They did exactly the same job. The KV had a 152mm howitzer mounted on the roof, and the KV-1 had a pretty good 85mm gun mounted on it. The early ones had a 76. Pretty good at killing tanks, and so these were the beginnings of that line of Soviet tank design. But of course there was the whole problem of the Germans invaded them. The Russians were planning on large-scale invasions of everywhere, and they just really didn't expect the Germans to be coming in the opposite direction. So there we have it. No last questions? Are you happy?
Yeah.
Yes, good. I hope the viewers are happy too. So these are the...
Maybe the viewers might want to know what happens if they're going to a city. What can they do against a city exactly? Or a village or something?
If you're playing bolt action with tanks, for city fighting, your tank is an artillery support vehicle and nothing else. That's all it is.
So they're not that useful then?
No, you want stuff like your Panzer IVs fitted with a howitzer. This is great, it's got a howitzer on it. You want anything that can take on masonry. So you want a 76mm gun, or like the German 75 on the Panzer IV, or a Stug with a 105mm gun on it. And you just want to drive to the outskirts of the city and level buildings. Your infantry go in and the tanks support the infantry. That's what they're designed to do. I'd never try to drive into a city with your tanks, they'll get massacred. Infantry will destroy them. Even in bolt action, the infantry will slaughter tanks. If you get enough infantry around a tank, the tank's dead. It's not easy, and you might lose some men doing it, but as we found in our last game we played, infantry versus tank, the infantry win. Because you've got so many infantry, each rolling dice to attack a tank. And I haven't got the rule book on me at the moment, I don't know where I put it. But I think depending on how fast the tank's going, there's a different dice roll you roll, and the easier it is to hit, and you can get multiple hits and therefore multiple chances of getting a better penetration.
And yours was just standing still.
And my tanks were standing still when you attacked them. Yeah, I didn't even know you were coming. And you wiped my tanks out. So that's what happens when tanks are not supported by infantry. It's a bit of a fallacy to think a tank is the awesomest thing on the battlefield. It's not. A tank on its own, or a couple of tanks together, really are vulnerable to enemy infantry, which is a good thing about this kind of design, because you are bristling with machine guns, and machine guns kill infantry. Machine guns are brilliant at killing infantry. At range, you need a howitzer to kill infantry, but your machine guns are awesome for it, and so this sort of tank's quite good. Unfortunately, this kind of design dropped out of favour, partly due to money and the circumstances, so it didn't really come in. No, but this particular tank in the city would probably fare slightly better than your T34, certainly your T26s and stuff like that. So you're pretty good. Your German tanks tend to be slightly better in bolt action because they have more machine guns. They have the fitted roof machine gun, they usually have a turret machine gun and a hull machine gun. So that increases the number of guns you've got going. The Russians tend to only have 1 or 2 machine guns fitted, so the Russians are usually at a bit of a disadvantage with their tanks against infantry for this period. But it depends what period you're playing in bolt action.
Well, that's all questions from me.
Yeah, well, you haven't used them yet properly yet though, so and you're a newcomer to this one.
I'm not Russians anyway, I don't play them.
No,
That's
no.
you.
No, yeah, I like playing Russians because I like Russians. Oh no, not Russians personally. Well, no, I like Russians personally. Russians are fine. But for World War II, I find Russians a very interesting army to use. I think one downside to many rule systems is they don't take into account the sheer ramshackle nature of the Russian military command. It was very hard for officers to issue orders during that particular period. Slightly less so than people like the Germans, who were a bit more modern, a bit more techie minded. There were more radios and stuff. The Americans were certainly more techie and more into communication. They used walkie-talkies and stuff and phones in the backs of their tanks, so an infantryman could talk to a tank crewman and say, hey, there's a sniper shooting at us. Bolt action doesn't really take that into consideration. But it is a very simple rule system, so it's not going to. And I've played rule systems that does take that into consideration, and it is a very long game. And a lot of tables to roll, and roll on this table to see if you can see, roll on that table. Bolt action's simple, if you can see it, you can shoot at it. That's brilliant. Yeah, so there we go. That's it, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been slightly intuitive and I haven't waffled too much. And if you are going to do T35s, there's some here, they're cool. Please subscribe and click like and leave any comments you like in the comments bar, and something else.
That's it.
Oh, I will mention that the Finns captured what they thought were 2 of these tanks. They're often misrepresented. Two experimental versions which look quite similar to these were actually captured by the Finns, and they're often quoted as being T35s. They weren't.
Oh.
So the Finns never actually caught an operational version of one of these. They did get an operational version, but that's a different story. But the ones captured and used by the Finns were actually not T35s. They were an experimental version of a T35-like tank, which I can look up for you if you want me to, but that's another story. So, like, and the other thing, leave any comments, and thank you for watching the video. This has been Vespasian. Goodbye.